Welcome, one and all, to Deep Time, the National Fossil Hall here at the National Museum of Natural History. And we begin with the spiral of time, which is a nice little representation of the various eras of Earth's geological history, beginning with the Paleozoic, and then moving on through the Mesozoic with the dinosaurs, and ending off in the Cenozoic, which is the era in which we currently live. And indeed it ends off with a mirror to show humanity's own role in prehistory. This is, in a very compressed form, the story of life on Earth. And from here, we leave the present day and go into the exhibit's first prehistoric world, which is both alien and familiar, the Ice Age. And we start off with something that might look familiar. This is an American mastodon, an exclusively American Ice Age relative of the elephants and the mammoths. And these were often found together with mammoths, and specifically the Columbian mammoth out west. Now, you may be wondering, how in the world did two such large animals actually coexist with each other? And to answer that, we must look at their jaws, and more specifically, their teeth. If you observe here, you will notice that the mastodon's molar teeth were extremely high-crowned, which actually led comparative anatomist Georges Cuvier in the 19th century to refer to this thing the name of mastodon, or breast tooth. And mastodons had teeth like this to browse on vegetation very high off the ground, in contrast to the mammoths, which were grazers, which we will see in a second. Now, next to the mastodon is another classic Ice Age animal. This one should look very familiar. This is the saber-toothed cat. Often incorrectly referred to as the saber-toothed tiger, though they were not in fact tigers. In fact, the saber-toothed cat was not even the largest carnivore that existed in its environments. It often had to compete with other carnivores such as American lions and short-faced bears, but it was of course still quite the nasty customer for anything that was on the wrong end of its jaws. Now, of course, the classic feature of the saber-toothed cat are its famous saber teeth, which were actually quite fragile, and thus it probably wasn't using them to hold prey in place. In fact, it was probably doing that with its forelimbs. The saber teeth were instead just a method to ensure the killing blow on whatever it was attacking. And saber-toothed cat seems to have been quite specialized at going after large prey, such as bisons and camels, and so on and so forth. However, even something like a saber-toothed cat would probably still balk at a mammoth or mastodon, as well as a creature like this one. This is a Rematherium, and it is a giant ground sloth. Of course, nowadays sloths are comparatively diminutive tree-dwelling creatures, but back in the Ice Age, they could grow to colossal sizes and they walked around on the ground. As you might imagine, they were quite dangerous towards anything that desired to attack them. On top of their enormous bodies, they also had these gigantic claws, which were intended to help snag fruit from branches, but were also quite useful defensive tools. Now, as you can see here, this mount is depicted as eating fruit. And in fact, there are several species of fruit that are still around today that you can find in the tropics that are not in fact eaten by any modern animals. And it seems that in fact these species of fruit co-evolved with the megafauna and relied on the megafauna to be distributed. So it is likely that many sorts of megafauna, such as the Rematherium, they probably suffered a fair deal due to climate change, but they were also probably in part hunted by early humans as well. Now, on the other side of the Rematherium is a fairly close relative of the thing. This is a Glyptodont, and it is a giant relative of the modern armadillos, and much like the armadillos, as you can see, it has a gigantic bony shell or carapace, which would have made it extremely difficult and dangerous for most any predator to take on. And next to the Glyptodont is a fossil horse. These were in fact once wild in North America, but then they died out during the Ice Age, and they were later reintroduced by the Europeans during the colonization of the Americas. In fact, there are records of native peoples recognizing horses based on myths of the ancient extinct horses that once lived in the region. Now, next up is the Ice Age's most famous animal. This, of course, is a woolly mammoth. Now, as you can see, although it looks quite superficially similar to the mastodon, it is not in fact terribly closely related to them. In fact, the woolly mammoth's closest extant relative is the Asian elephant. Now, if you will recall, the mastodon earlier had very high crowns on its teeth, whereas the mammoth, as you can see here, has much flatter teeth. And the mammoth's teeth in particular were very good for grazing or eating lots of grass. Of course, the other most famous feature of the mammoth is the giant tusks, which were probably quite helpful. In addition as defensive weapons, they were probably also quite useful for clearing snow, which is in fact how they have depicted the mount you see here. Now, based on extant elephants, it is very likely that male mammoths would have had larger tusks than the females, and they were probably also useful for intraspecific competitions. The woolly mammoth was in fact not the only species of mammoth that existed during the Ice Age, and in fact it was the smallest of them, although it was still quite large. And of course it had a very shaggy coat. It was well adapted for cold environments, as shown in these two dioramas. And indeed, as you can see in the diorama that we are showing here, mammoths tended to live in very seasonal environments, with hot summers but exceedingly cold winters. And mammoths, much like other Arctic animals alive today, would probably have had both winter and summer coats. So they would have shed quite a bit of their fur during the summer, only to then grow it back for the cold winter months. They may also have migrated north and south, depending on the seasons as well. And then, next to the mammoth, that brings us to the final large Ice Age mount. This is Megaloceros. It is a giant deer, often referred to as the Irish elk, although it is not only from Ireland, and it is not in fact an elk. And of course, the most notable feature of the thing are its gigantic antlers, the largest of any deer that has ever existed. As with deer nowadays, it was probably using those antlers for mating displays, potentially just for display, but also potentially for combat as well. They also probably would have been at least reasonably useful defense weapons against potential predators. And it is possible, although I don't know if it has ever been proven, but it is possible that these were male-only features as well, because the males were the ones who had to compete for mates. Now, as it happens, actually, this mount was the very first fossil mount the Smithsonian ever put up for display. The Smithsonian acquired this Megaloceros specimen in 1872, and it populated the Arts and Industries building before being moved here. Now, moving on from the Ice Age, we go even further back in time to the Neogene and the Paleogene. And this is where mammals truly took over after the demise of the dinosaurs. Now, coming into the Paleogene, the world was very hot and wet. There were no polar ice caps. Rainforests covered a great deal of the world. A big part of the reason why was because Antarctica was still drifting south, and only when Antarctica reached the South Pole did the world start to turn cold and dry. And as it was doing so, and as you can see in these two dioramas, the world changed from being primarily covered with rainforests to being primarily covered with grasslands. And as the environments changed, so too did the mammals change with them. And of course, one of the most major groups that had to adapt to changes such as these were the fossil artiodactyls. So these are creatures such as deer and camel, and as the Paleogene and especially the Neogene progressed, they became increasingly well adapted for life in the open grasslands. And of course, as the prey animals went, so too did the predators follow them. As predatory mammals moved into the grassland habitats, many of them became better adapted for distance running and pursuit predation instead of ambush, since it's not exactly easy to ambush things on the wide open plains of a grassland. And over here we see other examples of various artiodactyls. As I mentioned, these are by far the most successful mammalian herbivores, though their cousins the perissodactyls, which today number only horses, tapirs, and rhinos, were also quite successful during the Paleogene and Neogene. And in fact, one of the early perissodactyls was this thing. This is a classic hothouse mammal. This is a brontothere. It might look like a rhino, but in fact it isn't one. It is a semi-distant cousin. It was also a perissodactyl, and it was one of the largest early mammals. Now, as you can see, it has an absolutely colossal skull, and it has gigantic high-crowned teeth. This thing was probably a browser. It was very well adapted for eating foliage that was well off the ground, much in the same way as the mastodon. These things were also probably social creatures in some way or another. You will notice that you can actually see the horns on the skull of a brontothere. That is unlike modern rhinoceroses. In brontotheres, the horns were in fact actually made of bone, and they probably used them to fight each other, as well as also potentially to defend from predators. Now, brontotheres went extinct roughly 35 million years ago, at the beginning of the Oligocene, most likely because climate was changing, and the brontotheres could not handle the colder temperatures that resulted from Antarctica drifting south. And so, as the Eocene transitioned into the Oligocene, the brontotheres were replaced with other creatures that could better handle the new vegetation, both artiodactyls and perissodactyls, such as, for example, this creature. This is a calicothere. It is another perissodactyl, and yet another member of a now extinct lineage. These creatures also first appeared in the humid hothouse climate of the Eocene, but then later they diversified in the Oligocene, and they seem to have overall been better adapted for the colder, drier climates of the Neogene than the brontotheres were, as the calicotheres actually survived all the way until the early Pleistocene. Fossil evidence seems to suggest that calicotheres, unlike just about every other perissodactyl that has ever existed, were almost exclusively solitary animals, probably only coming together to mate before eventually leaving again to continue to pursue their solitary lives. Now, as you can see, calicotheres do show certain evidence of their perissodactyl ancestry. For example, the skull, as you can see here, looks surprisingly similar to the skull of a horse. However, calicotheres are also extremely unusual in certain other details of their anatomy, such as, for example, with these giant forelimbs. As you can see, these are sort of like the forelimbs of the giant ground sloth we saw earlier. They also have colossal claws on the ends, which they may have used for defense, but were probably more consistently used to pull and hold vegetation that the calicotheres could then consume. And to that end, as you might imagine, calicotheres were in fact very heavily adapted for browsing. They probably specifically went after things like fruits and seeds. And next to the calicothere is this grotesque-looking skull. This is the skull of a gomphothere, which is in fact an extinct relative of the elephant. And unlike modern elephants with their 2 tusks, the gomphotheres, such as this one, were extremely strange in actually having 4 tusks. And next to the gomphothere, we have the rhinoceroses. Now, in modern times, there are only a few species of rhinoceroses alive today, all of which are either endangered or critically endangered, unfortunately. But in prehistoric times, there were many, many other species. Many of them are grazers, unlike the extinct brontotheres, and some of them, such as this creature, Teleoceras, were even semi-aquatic, and would thus have behaved much like modern hippos, rather than modern rhinos. As you can see, rhinoceroses were an extremely diverse clade in prehistory, and One of the strangest was also one of the largest, namely this creature. This is Paraceratherium, also known frequently in historical literature as Indricotherium or Bellucitherium. This may well have been the single largest terrestrial mammal that has ever existed. And as you can see, it does not have any horns, but it has two very large tusks at the end of its jaws. These probably wouldn't have looked quite the same as elephant tusks, and we don't know exactly why it had them. Another quirk of Indricothere biology is that they probably would have had exceedingly long gestation times. Extant elephants already have to carry their young for about 2 years before they are ready to give birth, and something even larger, such as Paraceratherium, would probably have had to gestate for even longer, which explains why no mammals ever really grew larger than that, as any longer of a gestation period would make sustaining a population utterly unviable. This is why you never see any mammals that equate in size to the extinct sauropod dinosaurs. And if you were wondering why this problem does not apply to the whales, it is because the whales live within aquatic environments, which is much less taxing upon the body than having to support itself in the terrestrial environment in which the air is the primary fluid medium. Now, next to the series of rhinos is the first non-mammal I am going to show you here. This is Gastornis, although you may have heard it referred to as Diatryma. Now, for some time, it was actually in question whether Gastornis was in fact a predatory or a herbivorous bird. And indeed, when it was depicted in the documentary Walking with Beasts, it was depicted as a predator. However, later research has shown that it probably wasn't. The giant beak that it has was more likely used to crack open tough fruits or nuts than it was to crack open the skulls of smaller mammals. Fossils of Gastornis have been found throughout North America, Europe, and Asia throughout the Paleocene and Eocene, which are the two epochs directly succeeding the extinction of the dinosaurs. Although the genus seems to have originated from Europe at a time when Europe was effectively an island continent. And then over here is probably one of the strangest early mammals. This colossal beast is Uintatherium. This was probably the earliest truly large land mammal, as in rhino-sized or larger. It lived again in the Eocene, roughly 50 million years ago, and once again, the Eocene was a hothouse world filled with tropical rainforests. And for that reason, Uintatherium was probably a browser. Again, observe the high-crowned teeth, much in the same way as the mastodon and the brontothere. However, that is not the only strange feature in existence on Uintatherium's skull. Observe the saber teeth. Even though Uintatherium was not carnivore, it probably used those and its strange horns in intraspecific competitions against other males. As you might imagine, such a strange beast has no living relatives. And now, moving on from the Uintatherium, on the opposite side here is a collection of fossil marine mammals. These are fossil pinnipeds. They are relatives of the extant seals and sea lions, and much like their modern relatives, they were not fully aquatic. Unlike these creatures, these are sirenians, which today are represented only by the manatee and dugong, both of which are fully marine creatures. However, in the fossil record, there are several relatives. And not all of them, in fact, were fully marine. After all, they evolved from terrestrial ancestors, and this is one such creature. This is a semi-aquatic transitional sirenian. So in fact, it spends some of its time on land as well as in the water. Although, of course, the classic mammalian water-to-land transitional story is that of the whales. This is an early baleen whale, and although this one doesn't, some fossil baleen whales actually still had teeth as well. And next to that is one of the strangest creatures they have on display in the entire hall. Probably the single most ridiculous whale to ever have existed. This is the skull of Odobenocetops. As you can see, it looks vaguely similar to a walrus, and in fact the name Odobenocetops even means walrus whale face. For reference, the name of the walrus is Odobenus, and in fact there is the skull of a walrus directly to the right of the skull of Odobenocetops. And the most obvious feature of this skull are these utterly ridiculous looking tusks that are even larger than the tusks of the walrus. We really don't know exactly why Odobenocetops had these tusks, or why one of them was so much larger than the other. It is really just one of those paleontological mysteries. So, that was the Paleogene, Neogene, and Quaternary. Those three geological periods together form the Cenozoic Era, or the Age of Mammals. Now, we move yet further back in time. That's right. Next up is the Mesozoic Era and the dinosaurs. So stay tuned for that in the next video. Thank you once again for watching.